Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, "Sometimes the best revenges aren't planned in advance." My grandfather had been a soldier, boxer, police officer, and eventually became a farmer shortly after my father was born. We're from a small community in Canada where everyone knows everyone, and having a person bully others just isn't okay. My grandfather's farm was quite large. Acres upon acres of potatoes and grain, over 5,000 laying hens, and a sizable herd of pigs. But as all farmers at the time were, the local bank owned much of the farm. One year was a particularly rough year for them. Disease had spread through the pig barn and the entire herd was lost. This was devastating as it was their most valuable source of income. My grandfather had made arrangements with the bank that the grain harvest, which normally fed the pigs, would be sold to make payments on the loans to the bank. The banker was great with this. The problem arose when a new loan officer moved to the community and took over my grandfather's account. He demanded payment much earlier than what had been previously agreed. The revenge started with my grandfather inviting the banker out to the farm to discuss terms. They were walking through the completely empty pig barn. This was the type of barn where the manure from the pigs would flow out of the stalls, into a trough, and down to the end of the barn, filling a massive pit. Because of all of the recent rain in the area and the lack of use of the barn, the water had filled this pit and a nice layer of straw dust had settled over the entire thing. This caused two things. First, the concrete walkways were only raised about an inch over the manure-filled water, and secondly, unless you knew where you were going or looking down intently, it was easy to step off of said walkway. Well, the meeting wasn't going well. They were walking through the barn to the end of the row and my grandfather wasn't too pleased. They were walking with the banker in front, my grandfather behind him, and my father taking up the rear. As they came to the end of the row, the deep pit of manure was in front of them. My father saw that the banker was about to walk straight off of the path, so he reached out to grab the banker when out of nowhere my grandfather slapped his hand back and watched as the banker stepped off of the end in his suit and right up to his neck in pig manure. They grabbed a rope to help the poor guy out but wouldn't let him in the house to wash off at all. He ended up hosing himself off in the barnyard and driving back to town smelling like $1,000,000. Needless to say, the grain harvest came in a few weeks later and as originally agreed on, my grandfather made the payments. The next one is titled, "Caught Littering." Make sure your car tax is up to date. I was driving along minding my own business, when the car in front of me braked suddenly. No big deal, I always leave a generous gap in case things like that happen. Thinking nothing of it, I carried on driving. I then noticed the driver of the car in front of me was smoking a cigarette. Again, no big deal, no law against smoking while driving unless there's a child passenger in the UK. But then I see the driver throw their cigarette butt out of the open window. I hate littering and like to find ways to entertain myself while driving, so I decided to memorize the car's number plate, because why not? If they're careless enough to litter without a second thought, maybe they're also careless enough to not keep up with their responsibilities as a car owner. For example, their car insurance and MOT, annual inspection. When I got home, I wanted to see if I could still remember that number plate from earlier, and was successful. I entered it into the UK government website to check whether this car's tax and MOT is up to date. What did I find? The tax is overdue by over a month. The car was being driven illegally. Being caught with an untaxed vehicle can incur a fine of up to £1,000. As I said, I really hate littering. So I submitted an anonymous report online with the car's details to inform the DVLA that the car's tax is out of date. I doubt anything will come of it, and as the report was submitted anonymously, I'll never know if the driver will see any consequences. But it's nice to know that it's possible, all because they don't use a damn ashtray in their car. The next one is titled, "High on the Hogs, a story of pro-family revenge." So one of my brothers is adopted and is amazing. He didn't get anything handed to him in life and he's seriously one of the hardest working people I know. Just as he was starting his own family, he had even more financial burden due to some medical problems. Still, somehow he managed to build half a house on some land my dad sold him. He used the equity in that to get a second loan and finish it, and he had to fight the bank for that even. Time goes on and he begins to do really well, so he sells the first house he built at a profit and buys some land. Like 175 acres in the Midwest. He lives in a rural area. He likes to hunt and does some farming on the land, but the house that was there when he bought it isn't ideal, despite some major improvements and renovation. So he builds a third house and puts the house up for sale. He keeps the land around the house for hunting. This is important later. This is when one of his envious family members asks if he and his wife would consider selling them the house. They can only qualify for something like half of what it's worth, but my brother is a fairly generous guy. He agrees to sell the house to them at a rather hefty discount since they're family. I'm sure he felt some of their pain as well. He'd had his own difficulty back when he was starting out. The bank agrees to loan them the money. They can't go wrong. It's for way less than the property is worth, and the deal is done. A few short months go by. He's driving by the property and spots a for sale sign. He stops in and the husband explains that there were some things about the house they weren't happy with, so they were planning on selling it and buying a house more in town or something, etc. My brother explains that they got a sweet deal only because they were family and that he'd appreciate them selling the house back to him for what he sold it to them for. The husband basically closes the door on that, and my brother leaves. And he thinks about it. I'm 100% certain that the family members understood that they were getting a good deal because they were family, and he was happier selling it to them with the understanding that they weren't to take advantage of his good graces. This is a guy, by the way, that manages big projects. He's a really fair guy. The stuff he does in construction, probably half of you have driven over, big bridges that go over rivers like the Mississippi for example. He's used to solving hard problems. This one isn't that hard. The next day he drives out with some fence in the back of his truck, and the family members in the house wake up to some fence posts being driven into the ground. The husband comes out. "What's going on?" he asks. "I'm just putting up some hog fence on my property. Don't worry, it's all on my land. I'll just go around your house here and put a gate in so you can get in and out." The husband is a bit perplexed. "You're bringing in pigs?" And my brother was seriously set to do it too. He had about 100 lined up from a farmer down the road. The husband goes back into the house. A few minutes of discussion occur. The next day they all meet at the bank and the deed is transferred back to my brother. And he didn't even have to deploy the hogs. The next one is titled, Abandoned Ship. So this happened a few years back. I'm newly arrived in Canada, and despite my degrees and previous experience in my field in other countries, I just wasn't able to land a job. After a few months of this, and my savings drying up quickly, I figured screw it, I'm going to take a job as a waiter, busboy, anything. I immediately find a spot waiting tables in a restaurant. Things are not quite right with it though. The room is separated into two areas which are officially two different restaurants. Both of these belong to the same owner. Both of these share the same kitchen, and kitchen staff. The menu are wildly different however. Think of it as one is French cuisine and the other is Tex-Mex. I later found out that the owner would change the name and menu of the restaurants depending on their Yelp scores and whatever was the fad of the day. The same kitchen staff had been cooking Indian, Greek, Ethiopian, and French food over the years. Each time it changed he would post a sign out for a couple weeks, "New restaurant coming soon," and launch. Now all this doesn't have much to do with me, but I want you to get a good feel for how this guy thinks. A quick buck is all that matters. He applied that logic to everything. The cook should use no more than a thimble of cream per dish, refilling bottle of wine, putting cheap wine in expensive bottles and recorking them, pay everyone late and try to screw the waiters of wages. He had master control over the POS which calculated our hours and would change the numbers, and tips. This guy was something. Anyways, after 4 months of this horrendous experience I managed to land a perfect job in my field. I was to start 1 month later. Now a better man would have given notice to his current boss and let bygones be bygones. Not I. You see, I had become quite good friends with the cook. He was a poor sap that got suckered into the job. Unfortunately for him, because our boss was paying him late every time, at minimum wage I might add, he had fallen late on things like rent and credit card payments. He was completely broke, and the owner knew it and worked him to the bone. Unfortunately he had no time off to look for another job. Working 7 days a week was barely letting him pay off his debts. So I was upset at the owner. I went out of my way to get him an interview for a chef position in another restaurant a buddy of mine worked at, and covered the kitchen shift while he went. He got the job. That very same day we both went into the owner's office and told him we were quitting and no, we can't give 2 weeks notice. I got home feeling awesome. Then I went one step further. I called the Canadian Revenue Agency, like the IRS, and told them about the shady dealings. I followed that with every single agency I could think of: sanitation, labor, fire department, etc. I walked by the place 3 months later and it was closed, with a "for sale" sign. Turns out without his slave cook he couldn't find another chump to work for nothing, and he tried to take over the cooking himself. Customers fled. Add that to all the legal trouble he was in, he had no other choice but to sell to pay for lawyer fees. Probably a cheap lawyer too. The next one is titled, Nurse Gets Revenge on Passive-Aggressive Boss. Registered nurse here. My manager doesn't do a good job of being personable, and comes across very robotic. It's difficult for me because my intrinsic drive doesn't respond well to criticism, even of the constructive type, which she doesn't usually provide. She's more a negative criticism type of manager. I received an email from her on my day off full of passive-aggressive crap about how I had made a mistake. A physician had wanted a patient to go for a test and the patient needed to follow certain instructions: take this medicine the night before, then nothing by mouth after midnight type of instructions. The order went in at 10 p.m, I work 3 p. 11:30 p. The nurse coming on for the night shift didn't communicate with the patient that they weren't supposed to eat, drink after midnight, and the test was unable to take place. I didn't recognize the name of the patient in the email, and went back and checked the patient assignments for that particular day. As it turns out, I wasn't the nurse taking care of that patient. My day off had been ruined by thinking I had screwed up when I wasn't even involved. I sent her a response letting her know that I had nothing to do with the care of that patient. I also informed her that it was a direct violation of that patient's HIPAA rights, Private Health Information, Privacy Act, for her to have shared with me, a person who had absolutely nothing to do with the patient's care, both the patient's name, what he was being seen in the hospital for, and specific details about the tests that were going to be performed on him. I told her I regretfully had an obligation to report the incident to medical records because a breach of privacy had occurred, and included a screenshot from the mandatory bullshit training we do online every year about private health information. The next one is titled, Get Rid of My Dog, Wear My Favorite Jeans, and Burn My Cookware. Here chick, have a Craigslist roommate. I had a roommate in college who was a nightmare. She always tore up my dishes, my pots and pans, used my shampoo, wore my jeans, never asked permission, just walked into my room and took whatever she wanted. She had nothing of her own, I swear. My pots were just parts of a cheap set from Target, but they were all I had. The last straw was when she ruined one, heating it up with nothing in it. Why? The world may never know. I put all the pots and pans in my bedroom and kept my door locked after that. I also banned her from touching anything I owned or had purchased. I resorted to petty crap like these are my eggs and that is my remote. I was young and entirely too salty for my own good, I will openly admit. She was so upset after a week of being denied part ownership of my things that she ended up insisting that I move out. Bold move, honcho, considering it was my name on the lease, not hers, and I had been letting her live with me without putting her name on the lease. And we had another 2 months on our lease. But okay, fine, sounds great to me, bubbles. So I went to the landlord and informed him I wanted out of my lease. He was used to students bopping in and out college town, and he said as long as I could find a sublessor and give up my deposit to that person, I could leave early. Naturally, he didn't know, or probably care, they were seedy college apartments, that I had an illegitimate roommate who wasn't on my lease. Guess who got a new roommate courtesy of Craigslist, exactly 2 days later? Not me. I couch surfed with a friend across town until getting a better job and my own apartment. This sounds harsh for a burnt pan, but earlier in the year my dog bit her. He nipped her hand, there was no broken skin, just one hell of a bruise. He nipped her hand because he was in my room and she came in on her own accord when I was not home and reached over him, and the threshold to my door, to open my dresser. I had a baby gate blocking him in my room, so she had to admit that's what had happened, but said she needed her necklace that was mysteriously in my room. Her parents bullied 20-year-old me into giving him away because I was young and scared of getting in trouble. I was paying my own rent and needed her half. I ended up agreeing to give the dog away to a friend. The whole ordeal was terrible. Shortly after that, she got a cat. I think the whole thing was a setup so she could get a cat without my dog trying to eat it. Back to the Chinese roommate. Guy found my ad, said he and his wife would take it, and they were at the door to the leasing office to sign papers the next day. She was livid. Her parents were livid. She had told them she was on the lease, and they had been paying for half the rent, so the sudden realization that she was lying and that she had nowhere to live was a bit exciting for everyone involved on that end. But there was nothing they could do. It was my apartment and I had the right to sublet it, as she was not on the lease. Which, don't use my pans. I would like to note that I have mellowed quite a bit in the past several years. I also lived alone after that until I met my husband 5 years later, so maybe that helped. I never apologized for forcing her to live with a random Chinese man and his wife, though. And I have no idea how long she was still there with them until she moved. He had the right to kick her out. I assume he did. So Maggie, I'm sorry I possibly forced brief homelessness upon you when we were sophomores in college. Also, duck your cat. The last one is titled, The Best Schadenfreude I Will Ever Know. I meant to share this story some time ago, but it slipped away from me until I remembered today. It's a shame to keep it to myself, although it is a little sad in places, but I hope you can enjoy it. About a year ago around this time, my mother was approaching her last days. She had lived a hard life and it caught up with her all too quickly. She didn't have much left to her name, but she made sure I had possession of her car. It was an absolute wreck despite having a good engine, and I knew it would never sell, but it was all she had to give. Not long after she had passed away, I was contacted by the welfare-type agency she had been getting support from. They said my mother's spouse or dependents were entitled to some of money to help pay for final arrangements. I was happy to hear this, as I had had to pay for the funeral by myself and the expense had really hurt me. However, they didn't want to give the money to me. I was a year outside their range for dependents. Instead, since my parents had divorced an eternity ago, they wanted to give the money to my younger sister. My deadbeat sister, who had run out on my mother while she was ill, stolen from her to buy drugs, and only showed up at her deathbed to scream at her. They told me the money would go to her or it would vanish. I was torn over what to do, but remembered that my sister had recently had her car impounded. With cold certainty, I knew what I needed to do. I gave them my sister's contact info and had my father get in touch with my sister. I would sell her the car for the majority of what they were giving her, which was honestly not a terrible deal. She tried to haggle, but she needed a car too badly. A week later, fighting against her wanting to meet up at every shady place imaginable, we meet up in a public spot and made the exchange. I had a friend with me at the time for backup, and he could do nothing but stare goggle-eyed at the events that took place. It's easiest if I lay them out like this. She had blown her portion of the money on a fair amount of meth and was stoned out of her mind. After taking the car from me, she learned that its tank was on fumes. She tried to argue, and the 3 creepy dudes she had with her wanted to make a scene, but they couldn't do a thing while we stood in a crowded supermarket parking lot. As they drove off, I informed my friend that I had been unable to find the title for the vehicle and that it was still registered under my mother's name and was most certainly not in the glove box of that car. Additionally, my sister has an expired license and has a warrant out for her arrest due to evading parole. I very nearly dialed the non-emergency line to report the car as stolen after this. I should have, considering she was driving it while ducked up and could have killed someone, but my father had begged me to give her a chance. Either way, it ended up with the same result. A week later, the car was found abandoned and was impounded just like her previous car. She was picked up as well and learned that she was going to real prison this time instead of a short stint in a youth correction center. She's still there now and will be for the next several years. I may not have put her there myself, but I unloaded a burden onto her and got what should have rightfully gone to me back first. The last one is titled, When One Back Door Shuts, Another Opens. I worked the graveyard shift at an up-and-coming data center. Despite the usual corporate politics and drama, it's generally a pleasant place to be employed. The pay is decent, benefits are okay, the administrators are laid back, and there's very little in the way of formal policies and procedures to follow. As enjoyable as that sounds, there's also a lot of room for improvement. Most notable of things that pertain to me is that the night crew is an underwhelming assortment of individuals with a varied level of skill. The majority of these coworkers are fresh out of VOTech and serve little purpose other than being meat shields for irate customers. It's the more experienced technicians like myself who wind up doing most of the heavy lifting, a small price to pay for not having to take calls from belligerent foreigners whose email marketing, i.e. spam businesses, seemingly crumble every time the network slows. Because of the understaffing and lack of expertise at night, we don't often have the luxury of researching trouble tickets in depth and occasionally have to escalate the more time-consuming or specialized tickets to senior staff who are only available during normal business hours. The daytime roster, on the other hand, is well oversaturated and corporate titles are contrived and so plentiful they are literally meaningless. The more the elaborate a title, the more arrogant and overbearing that person generally is. And the only thing that these smug bastards truly excel at is finding reasons and ways to shift responsibility to someone else, preferably back to the lower life forms that comprise our general support staff like myself. When a ticket requires such an escalation, more often than not, the original agent is the recipient of a vicious email regarding the simplicity of the issue, their lack of intelligence and problem-solving skills, and the audacity of having bothered them with the matter to begin with. Adding insult to injury, forwarding these emails along with complaints to administration ordinarily results in little more than an appeal to learn how to accommodate people's differing personalities and better work as a team. One senior staff member in particular is known by all to be the worst in this regard. Despite only tenure, a mediocre grasp of a particular expertise and a coincidental vacancy being responsible for his elevation in stature, his pretentiousness is matched only by his need for attention. But after nearly a year of his abuse, the tide suddenly turned. While mitigating one of my complaints against him, an administrator attempted to justify his misconduct by chalking it up to stress caused by the fact that the availability, uptime, of the servers for which he was responsible contributed to both his weekly pay and quarterly performance review, and recent software upgrades were causing headaches. It took me little time to use this information to cook up a diabolical scheme that would satisfy my need of retribution. Within a few days I had concocted a shell script which I subsequently uploaded to each of the servers residing under his supervision. The premise of the script was simple: create a scheduled task to randomly reboot the server. On occasion a server would restart after a couple of days, periodically a few times in a single day. Rarely, because I didn't want to punish our customers too badly for the sake of my revenge, it would even trigger a disk integrity check, a process which can take hours on some servers. And because he lacked in-depth comprehension of the server's operating system and security as a whole is little more than an afterthought at the data center, covering my tracks required little more than truncating a few log files. 4 months passed. Tensions grew. His emails became more terse, more agitated, and more frequent until it was no longer justifiable by the rest of the administrative staff. He began lashing out at everyone around the office until he had to be relocated to an isolated part of the building where he could be kept away from the rest of the team and constantly supervised. Finally, after one particularly ill-timed outburst directed at other senior staff members, he was left with little recourse but to offer his resignation. 2 weeks have passed. The office is now a much more harmonious place to work and much of the egoism has ceased. Better still, one of my nighttime co-workers and friends was recently promoted to fulfill a certain vacancy on senior staff, and I hear that the servers are running better than ever now thanks to his efforts. Thanks for listening.